Welcome to the Canadian Institute of Forestry's National Electronic Lecture Program. My name is Sharon Young, and I'll be hosting today's session. Today is Thursday, April 23rd, 2026, and this is the second session in the E-Lecture series entitled Growing Climate Resilient Urban Forests, Species Selection and Assisted Migration Strategies. This series is brought to you by Tree Canada. The CIF-IFC is very pleased to collaborate with Dr. Adrina Bardakjian and the team at Tree Canada to host these webinars. Today's webinar is titled The Use of Functional Traits in Planning for the Resilient Urban Forests. A special reminder that the ISA-certified arborists are eligible to receive one continuing education unit for this webinar. Please email electures@cififc.org with your full name and your ISA certified ID in order to obtain the ISA Continuing Education Unit. Once we verify your attendance, we'll send your information to ISA for them to process. Today we have Kaylee Hatt-Taylor, Coordinator of Research and Engagement from Tree Canada, to introduce today's e-lecture speakers. With that, I will now pass it over to Kaylee.
Thank you, Sharon. On behalf of Tree Canada, I just wanted to say good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you again for taking the time to join us for the second e-lecture session in this series. We're very pleased to be bringing together forestry professionals on this topic of climate resilient urban forests to explore topics like species selection, assisted migration, and functional traits in planting and planning like we are today. This is a topic that we've heard time and time again from our colleagues as a top priority, so we're very happy to see it come to fruition in this series. As always, I want to thank Sharon and the team at CIF for the coordination and their partnership on this e-lecture series. And without going any further, I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers today. So today we have Dr. Christian Messier and Dr. Julie Messier joining us. Christian is a professor of forest ecology and urban forestry at the University of Quebec in Canada. His research interests range from the basic understanding of tree growth and death, forest ecosystem functioning, to decision-making tools to better manage natural and urban forests. He holds an industrial NSERC research chair on tree growth since 2010. Julie is an assistant professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Waterloo, whose research sits at the intersection of trait-based plant ecology, phenotypic integration, and community ecology. Her work links plant trait ecology with climate change and ecological adaptation across scales. She's excited to apply her expertise in plant traits and community dynamics to the practical challenges faced in urban settings. Thank you both very much for sharing your insights and expertise today. You can go ahead.
Yes, hello everybody. I will be the first presenter, Christian Messier. And before to start, you may have noticed that there's two Messier presenting today. So I'm very, very happy today to present with my niece. And I could say that I may have had a bit of an influence over the years, but that she is doing very well on her own as a great scientist. So we want to talk about the use of functional traits. I think a lot of you have heard about it. And we want to convince you that functional trait could be a very powerful tool to help make our forests more resilient. So this will be actually the main focus of our task. And we will switch from me starting, and then Julie will take over, and then we'll switch a few times. So let's start. I will start, as I usually do, to depress everybody by saying that the future is bleak because of lots of threats, so I will enumerate them. Then Julie will have a more uplifting presentation where she will explain to you people what are traits and how they can relate to tree resilience to climate change. Then I will talk a bit about a few metrics that people have developed and that I have developed in my group to manage and measure resilience. I will introduce a tool that we have been developing as part of this urban chair that I lead called Série. And then Julie will terminate or finish by making a proposal to all of you to ask you if you want to join us trying to make Canada a world leader in urban tree resilience. So let's start with the kind of a depressing part of the talk, the threats. And I like to show this picture because this is me at night when I sleep more or less well. This is what I see. There's a lot of threats, there's a lot of concern, and I think we should not avoid thinking about them, but they are a solution. And this is maybe the best part of this talk, is we'll really discuss what we can do. But when we talk about threats, I mean, you know, we have insects, and one of the maybe the most well-known recently is the emerald ash borer that has been decimating our urban forestry. And there's a reason why we should worry in Canada, and I showed this map. It's because in Canada, we trade a lot with Europe and Asia that tend to have a very similar climate, very similar biome, and so the risk of having pests and insects coming to our country is actually extremely high. Another threat that you may not have think of normally, but it's what I call the uniformity of our tree that we see in our urban setting. And this is a good example. This is from Montreal, but in many places you will see these kind of alignment of trees, same species, same age. So if there is an insect, they will all die at the same time. And this is a very good example from the Connecticut, a small village in the Connecticut that was affected by the Asian longhorn. They had beautiful maple, but they all died because they were all being affected by the same species at the same time. Climate change, of course, we hear a lot about it. We may not hear so much about it in terms of our trees and forests in urban areas, but there are a lot of indications that they are being affected. This is a picture from Boston from a colleague that was showing me that a lot of the trees in Boston are starting to die because of drought and too much heat. And in Montreal, we are very familiar with the increase in wind and ice storm, which is also related to climate change. And just to start talking about one of the concern, uniformity, this is actually a study that I did at the very beginning that I started to work in urban forestry. This was published in 2013, where we look at the effect of urbanization on tree species and functional diversity in Eastern North America. So we look at some of the cities on the eastern part of the US. They had a very good database. And what we did is we compare the diversity in species and in functional diversity. And if you ask what it is, you will know very soon. But just to give you an example, we compare for a 1 hectare area in the city, what was the species and the functional diversity, similar area in the suburb, more kind of in the countryside, and similar area in a natural forest. And in most cases and in most cities, you could see that for the same area, the diversity in the city tend to be much lower because we have tended over the years to plant species in kind of as a group, 1 species or 2 species in a street or in a park. Insects and disease, I mentioned about it. This is an interesting graph that shows the increase in the number of species detected that are invading our countries. Here is the US, Europe, and New Zealand, but it's very similar in Canada. And when we go from the 1800 to 2010, you can see a steady increase, and it will keep increasing. So we will have new species. Some of them will do not much damage, but some of them, like the emerald ash borer, might decimate a species. Climate change. We know climate change is occurring. What we don't know is what will it be in the future? Will it be a small increase of 2 degrees because we can control our emission, or a big increase of even up to 5 degrees because we continue on the same path that we are now? So we don't know, there's a lot of uncertainty. But what we are starting to know, and this is what I want to show in these two articles, we are starting to look at what are the likely impact of these climate change on the trees found in the streets and in our parks in the future. This is a very nice study done that look at over 164 cities in 78 countries in the world. They look at what will be the impact in 2050 based on the kind of an average increase in temperature for two type of temperature increase or climate changes, a mean annual temperature and annual precipitation. And this is based on this design that we call or this index called the safety margin. And I will explain a bit what it is. I will come back to it later, but if we take an example of a species, silver maple, you see here the species realized climate niche. This is the mean annual temperature where we find the species over its whole range in North America. And you have here the 95 percentile, which gives, based on this study, the limit that we use to say that the species will be at risk or not at risk. So if you are in a city and your mean annual temperature is 28 degrees, you are below the 95% percentile. So according to this study, you are on the safe side. But the city in 50 years might actually move with a higher temperature, move to a mean annual temperature of 30 degrees, and then you will have a negative margin, safety margin, and then you will be what we call in the high risk. And this study showed that over the world, and if we look at the northern hemisphere, lots of cities will see around 75 to 100% of their trees being above the safety margin. So they will risk of being more sensitive to any stress. It doesn't mean they will all die, but there will be heavy stress on them and they will be more susceptible to insects or other disturbances. And another study that we just submitted to Nature, Ecology, and Evolution by the same group, adding a few more species, and I was involved in this study, where we look at not only the impact in terms of the safety margin, but also in terms of the ecosystem services that these tree and forest producers or they make in our cities. And we look at cities across North America and Europe, and we use the safety margin and also the I-tree model that most of you must know. And in this study, we project that 61 to 82% of the species in North America and Europe will exceed the tolerance limit in one of the variables that we measure by 2050 based on a kind of average climate change, which will drive a decline in 45% of 15 ecosystem services. And I will finish this, my depressing introduction, by showing that for some species, it's very different. For example, if we look at Quebec City in Canada and San Francisco, they will be among the worst cities in the North America and Europe. They might lose between 75 and 100% of the services provided by the trees. You can see this on the x-axis. These are the different services that was calculated. Whereas if you're in Houston, Las Vegas, or Lausanne in Europe, then you might lose only between 10 and 25%. So this study is actually showing that there will be a lot of variation and that cities should start looking at where they will be in terms of this loss of resilience and services and may want to act accordingly today, probably by using what I will suggest be some approach based on functional traits. Julie.
Thank you, Christian, for that introduction. I first wanted to thank CIF and Tree Canada for hosting us. This is a great opportunity, so thank you. So following Christian's introduction, in the second part, I will show you how, in fact, we can use plant traits as a tool for all these challenges, and specifically to improve tree resistance to climate change in urban settings. So in this second part, I'm going to cover 3 topics. First, I'll talk about what are functional traits and where they come from. Then I'll talk about how they can inform species-level resistance to climate change, so species selection for planting. Then I'll talk about how traits can improve community-level resistance, but at a different scale. So functional traits come out of the field of functional ecology. Not surprisingly, you can see the commonality in the naming. And in fact, there's a journal called Functional Ecology, and here I'm showing you the very first issue, which was published in the 1987s. So in the late 1980s, functional ecology essentially emerged out of comparative ecology. So they're like 2 twin fields. Comparative ecology has as a goal to identify universal patterns in species adaptation to their environment. So what are the main ways in which different species differ in how they're adapted? So functional ecology is essentially asking the very same question, but here we're really focusing on phenotypic traits. There we go. There's my definition. So functional ecology explains adaptations using traits that reflect species ecological strategies. So this approach became very popular in the early 2000s after a few dimensions of trait variation were identified and summarized here in these papers by Westby. So we had the leaf dimension, height dimension, and seed dimension. And now we were able to classify all the diversity of plants on life along these 3 dimensions. And that was really useful to do a lot of research. So it really gained a lot of traction in plant ecology. Oh, there we go. Okay. In 2007, Cyril Viol and his colleagues proposed a formal definition. So they defined functional traits as morphological, physiological, or phenological traits that impact fitness indirectly via their effects on growth, reproduction, and survival. And this definition was important because it helped separate functional traits from other types of traits, such as environmental tolerances that are defined at the species level, life history traits, and fitness components. And this, therefore, helped make the field more coherent, and that made the approach more popular. So just to give you an overview of where we stand today with traits and plant strategy dimensions, I'm going to go over 8 commonly defined trait dimensions and the main traits reflecting them. So first here we have like a stripped down tree. And this is illustrating that the maximum height is a reflection of the plant strategy for how they compete for light. So shorter plants have opted to tolerate shading, and tall plants are obviously competing for access to light. The second axis here differentiates leaves that are fast at acquiring carbon, but don't last very long, and slow in their carbon acquisition, but they have a very slow carbon turnover. And that's typically referred as the leaf economic spectrum because it has to do with carbon economics. Is it fast or slow economics? And some of the traits that are commonly measured to reflect that are leaf mass per area and leaf nitrogen content. We have 2 trait dimensions that are in the roots that are so far have been well defined. So we have the collaborative versus independent trait dimensions, and this differentiates roots that rely extensively on their mycorrhizal symbionts to acquire carbon versus roots that don't tend to associate and just do their nutrient acquisitions themselves. And so this is associated with the the traits on fine roots, so these fine absorptive roots, not the coarse roots, but a specific root length and root diameter on those fine roots. The second dimension in root traits is the root economic spectrum. So that's a direct analogy to the leaf economic spectrum. So that reflects roots that are either fast or slow in their acquisition of their acquisition and turnover of nutrients. So some of the root traits associated with that include root tissue density and root nitrogen content, again, only in those fine absorptive roots. The fifth dimension is that of seed size. It was one of the originals from Westby's summary papers. And you're probably familiar with it. On one hand, you have species that make a lot of small seeds, and these small seeds are going to disperse in many more different environments. So they're sampling the environment better, but their probability of an individual seed succeeding in that environment is much lower because they don't have a lot of resources. Whereas other species produce much fewer seeds, but they're much bigger, so they don't sample the environment as much, but the probability of a seed surviving an adverse environment is much better because it has access to these resources. Then we have wood density, and that's essentially correlated with a lot of super important ecological aspects. So it correlates with growth and mortality rates, and it also reflects hydraulic and mechanical stress tolerance of the species. And last, I said 8, but there's 7 dimensions. So last, we have this trade-off between hydraulic safety versus efficiency of a given wood. So that's reflected by the size of the vessel elements in the xylem, which are these big pipes that you can see in white here in the figure conducting the sap. I want to mention that a caveat is about this approach is that this is ongoing work. This is work in progress. So as you can see, we've done tons of progress since Mark Westaby's leaf, height, and seed strategy dimension. There were 3, now we're at 7, but we're still developing these tools. So some relationships have been really well established. They're consistent across all scales and all ecosystems, and others not so much. Okay, in the early 2000s as well, some papers have showed that some traits can determine ecosystem function. So for example, if we're interested in water interception, water recharge, carbon capture, nutrient cycling, etc. So ecosystem ecology, therefore, became very interested in using functional traits to predict ecosystem services. However, now you can see that there's these 2 approaches. There's functional traits that are meant to reflect a plant's adaptive strategy, but then there's also traits that affect ecosystem function. So they're functional because they affect ecosystem function. So to try to resolve this duality, in 2002, Lavorel and Garnier and Sudding proposed this framework where we still call this above functional traits, but there's 2 types of traits. There's the response traits and there's the effect traits. So response traits are, like as the diagram shows here, the traits that determine a species' response to its environment, and therefore how the tree is adaptive to its environment. So that's essentially the Cyril Viol definition that I proposed to you earlier. But that is the only definition used in comparative ecology. But if you step back to all of ecology, we'll just call that response trait to make that clear. And then the other trait is effect traits, so functional effect traits. And here, when we say function, we're really interested in the ecosystem function. So they're the traits that determine ecosystem function. Okay, though both response traits and effect traits can be really useful for urban forestry, and that's because effect traits will allow us to choose species that perform ecosystem services in urban areas. So if we're interested in improving cooling, we'll select traits that increase shading and cool the city. If we're interested in carbon capture, we'll select effect traits that increase plant growth. Or if we're interested in stormwater interception and runoff management, we'll choose traits that increase those ecosystem functions. Oops, I'm going backwards. That's not what I want. So on the other hand, we have response traits, and those can help us make informed predictions about which species will withstand specific stressors from climate change. So there's a lot of stressors that Christian told us about, but from climate specifically, we expect higher maximum summer temperatures, so more extreme heats. We expect more variable springtime temperature that is dangerous because it can lead to spring frost or just the bud coming out early and then freezing again. There's going to be more drought. So in a lot of areas in Canada, we don't predict lower precipitation, but because there's more heat, there's more of that water that evaporates from the environment. So there's less available for the tree. So the tree is still experiencing water limitation. There's going to be more flooding, more fires, etc. Okay, so here in this section, moving on to section 2, I want to talk about how we can use traits to choose those species that are resistant to those stressors that I just talked about. So here I'm telling you about what do we know so far about these response traits specifically to climatic stressors. So I don't have an exhaustive list. This is just to illustrate. So neither for the climate change stressors, nor the example of the traits, but I'm still like giving you, a few examples. So in response to extreme heat, the trees that do better tend to actually have a specific branching pattern that increases their self-shading. And they also have a lower threshold to heat shock protein induction. So they just start expressing those heat shock protein at lower temperatures. In response to spring frost, the traits that affect species performance are their chilling requirements and their bud burst heat sum. In response to drought, trees that do better have increased rooting depth and smaller vessel diameter. In response to strong winds or windstorms, here there's different strategies, so different traits, because wind failure has many mechanisms. So they can break the stem, they can break the branches, or they can uproot the whole tree. So there's a variety of traits that improve species resistance to strong winds, such as higher wood density, smaller trees, increased branching flexibility, increased rooting depth, and more compact crowns. And in response to flooding, that's my last example, trees that happen to have parenchyma, that have more adventitious roots, or that have hypertrophied lenticels also do better in those environments. Okay, here again, I want to mention some caveat. This is also work in progress, but here I call it an opportunity because we have the opportunity to come and fill those gaps for our needs in this urban setting. So this is research we can do. So specifically for some traits, there is data that is missing for many temperate and boreal species. So here's an example of data matrix with a lot of gray question marks. We just don't have those trait values yet. So for example, a trait that's really kind of under measured is the heat shock protein induction thresholds for the species around here. It's also not clear how much these traits vary within species. So here I show a picture that illustrates that we typically tend to take a single trait value for every species, but in reality, as you all know, there's many traits, there's so much variation within each species in the phenotype, right? So we don't know how much the traits vary among provenances that are probably adapted to different environments or just have different genotypes. How much traits respond to plasticity. So if I plant a tree as on a boulevard, it will clearly have a different crown architecture than if I planted it in a crowded forest. And we also don't know which species show most variation. So some species might be very variable, others not very variable. So these are a lot of gaps that we can fill. Okay, next I want to give you example of two studies that I conducted recently on the relationship between traits and performance under climate change. In this first study, we're looking at Montmégantic, which is a natural forest in Quebec. I know it's not an urban forest, but if you can bear with me for the next 3 slides, you will see that the results of this study are relevant for the use of traits in urban ecology. Okay, so the context is that a survey had been done on the mountain where they had established about 80 plots along the elevational gradient. So that was back in 1974. And then my collaborators had resampled the same plots in 2012, 40 years later, to see how species composition and abundance had changed. Over that same time period, there has been warming of the climate. So the region in general is 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer. And there's been continuous, low level, but continuous atmospheric deposition of fertilizers. So they observed that some species had increased in abundance. Some had increased a lot. Others had increased a little bit. Others had decreased. And they observed that some species had migrated a lot, uphill a lot. Some species had migrated uphill just a little bit, some didn't migrate, some even migrated downhill. So the question that came from this is like, what is going on and why? Can we predict what species is going to do what? And of course, coming in with my trait knowledge, my first hypothesis is that, well, it has to do with the plant's phenotype. So if we could only find out which traits predict which species will increase or decrease in abundance, and which traits will predict which species will increase or decrease along the elevational gradient, that would help us really manage those species better and know like which are going to be the winners of climate change so we can use that, and which one are going to be the losers, and do we want to worry about their conservation and management. So yeah, so the question I asked was which traits predict species shift in abundance and elevation in response to global change. So really quickly, the methods, I studied the 50 most abundant understory plant species. So I studied shrubs, perennial forbs, ferns, and club mosses. On each of those species, I measured many individuals to get an average value for 11 traits. So I had maximum height, leaf traits, root traits, and biomass allocation. And I'm going to skip over the analyses because for the interest of time, but the key results is that we found that the shifts in elevation are predicted by rooting depth of the species and the biomass allocations to leaves. So if you look at the total biomass of the plant, which fraction is allocated to leaves as opposed to stem or roots? And that the change in abundances, in fact, were predicted by the extent to which that species is relying on its association with the mycorrhizal fungi. So this is very interesting because we weren't expecting root traits to play such an important role. We only measured 2 root traits, and they're the 2 traits that came out to be significant in our analyses. So this illustrates the importance of root traits in the adaptation to global change in general. So in our urban forest, everybody tends to measure leaf traits, wood traits, and look at the above ground phenotypes simply because logistically it's just so much easier. Yet we really need to pay attention to those root traits to maybe have a sense of which species is going to be winning or losing in response to climate change. I'm going to also want to talk about a second study that I did, and this one is just published, so it's still in early view, so it's available online. So here we looked again at the relationship between traits and performance, again in response to climate change, but we're taking an intraspecific lens. So we're looking at variation within black spruce. So the context here is we know that black spruce is a dominant species in the boreal forest. We know that black spruce is really important for the forestry sector and for the ecosystem in general. And we also know that the boreal forest is one of the quickest warming biome on the planet. So black spruce is experiencing strong climate changes right now. So the gap is that we don't know which traits make trees perform well in warmer and drier conditions. However, would be really useful for choosing which provenances to plant. So if different provenances have different traits and we know which traits are associated with success under warmer climates, we could selectively plant those provenances. So the question that we asked was, in black spruce, which traits improve growth rates in warmer and drier conditions? So again, a quick overview of the method. So we took advantage of provenance trials. So they're essentially common gardens that were established 50 years ago by forestry companies along with the Canadian and provincial governments. And so there's many plots across Canada, but we wanted to find a climate gradient. So we picked 3 plots that went from colder to warmer temperature. So our cold plot was in Chibougamau, just in the center of Quebec. Our warmest plot is in Petawawa, which is about an hour north of Ottawa. And the intermediate plot is Chapleau, so that's also about an hour north of Sault Ste. Marie in Ontario. So here we measured, for each site, we measured about between 130 and 160 trees. On each of those trees, we got the growth rate as our performance response. And we measured 10 traits, so leaf traits, branch traits, and wood traits. So we found that in hotter and drier climates, so in our Petawawa site, or warmest site, the trees that grew faster had these 3 traits together. So they didn't have them individually. So if a trait had one of these 3 traits alone, but not the other 2, that didn't help, but they needed to have all 3 together. So the first trait was needles with high carbon to nitrogen ratio. So that reflects a conservative metabolic rate. Needles with high water use efficiency. So here, that's just the name is self-explanatory. That's conservative water use. And then trees had branches with higher Uber value. So that means that there were fewer needles per unit sapwood that served all these needles on that branch. So that means there was a higher ratio of water supply to demand, which again indicates conservative water use. So these 3 traits together tell us that the tree is, yes, it's getting both hotter and drier, but the black spruce are really experiencing drought stress. They're responding to a water limitation. And these results, again, are very useful because they can inform decisions about which provenances to plant in black spruce. Of course, we can't translate those results to other species, but it's the kind of species that the studies that would be really useful to repeat on our species that we plant. So we do, and this also highlights the fact that we do have the opportunity to take advantage of that large intraspecific variation within species to go get the variation that we want, that we need to plant the best adapted provenances. So here's just a quick a picture of the header of the paper. That's the full title, so in case you're interested in knowing more about it. Okay, and last in the third section, I will talk about how we can also use traits to create communities that are more resistant to stressors that are induced by climate change. So as Christian mentioned, the challenge is that future urban forests will face not only multiple stressors, but they're really unknown. So we don't really know which is going to come first or which is going to be worse. Is it going to be heat, drought, flooding, pests, or storms? Maybe Quebec City will experience a lot of storms. Maybe Ottawa will experience a lot of flooding. I mean, Tremblant right now has been experiencing a lot of flooding, but like they're all coming, but we don't really know which to prepare for, or yeah. The other thing is we know that single species are adapted, no single species is adapted to tolerate all future stressors. So there are trade-offs among the phenotypes, and species tend to develop adaptation to one or the other, but not all at once. There's not like one super species that can just do well. So therefore, it becomes really risky to rely on a few species. Even if you do your best guess, what if you're wrong? You might lose your entire forest, as Christian was talking about the danger of these monoculture. So that has happened in some cities. So then the question becomes, how do we design resistant communities? And the solution, as Christian has alluded to, is that we need communities with trait diversity. So here I'm just showing an example of two papers that come to this conclusion, but there's really like a deep literature all coming to the same conclusion. Trait diversity helps with community level resilience. Okay, so why? This is quickly explaining the mechanism. So a diversity of response traits means that you have different species that are resistant to different stressors. So some traits will confer resistance to drought, others to late frost, etc. So the reason why it works, it's called the portfolio effect, and this is the exact same principle as the portfolio effect in investing. So when we have different assets that vary differently over time, that respond differently to economic challenges, the overall portfolio is a lot more stable. So here, when different species perform differently over time, on average, the entire community is a lot more stable. And this is due to the asynchrony in their response. So here I'm just adding a little figure to illustrate that. On the x-axis, we have time. On the y-axis, we have abundance. And we see that the fluctuation in abundance in the green species is the opposite as the fluctuation in abundance to the blue species. So that's perfect negative synchrony. But the thing is that mechanism still works even if it's not perfectly negative, as long as you have independent fluctuation over time of different species that leads to a more resilient community abundance. So in summary, this is why forests with diverse traits are a lot more resistant to uncertain future conditions. Okay, here I just want to give two examples of studies that have used this approach to improve the resilience of urban forest. In this first study by Núñez Flores and colleagues that was published in 2019, they worked in the city of Ibagué in Colombia. So they used 9 functional traits to classify 202 urban tree species. And based on those functional groups, they made planting recommendations for each of the sectors of the urban areas based on species traits and matching them to the right type of environment. In another study by Griot and colleagues that just came out last year, that was they worked in Lisbon in Portugal, and they used 20 functional traits to classify 323 urban species and functional groups again. And they were able to make recommendations of increasing functional diversity in order to improve climate resilience, yeah. Okay, so to wrap up this second part, what have we learned? We've learned that there are 2 ways to use traits to increase resilience to urban forest. Either we can strategically plan for individual known stressors and therefore plant species with the right traits that are adapted to those stressors. So here again, I'm reminding you of some of those examples. Or we can plan for multiple unknown stressors. So then at the community level, you'll want to increase your trait diversity, and that will increase the diversity of response, and that will reduce the risk at the community level. Okay, I think I'm done. Back to you, Christian. He will then tell us about how we can use traits to develop, they've used traits to develop specific tools to improve urban resilience.
Merci, Julie. Thank you, Julie. That was a very, very good lecture. I wanted to go on some metrics for managing resilience that we can use, some that have been developed in my lab and some elsewhere. And I've already mentioned about the safety margin, but I wanted to show this paper that we published with the originator of this approach for Canadian cities. So safety margin, just to remind you, is a measure of how close a species is to exceeding its climatic tolerance under projected future conditions. So just to give you an example, here is another species, sugar maple tolerance. You have the kind of climate niche here in terms of tolerance to mean temperature of the warmest month. And if you are in a location that is likely to go above this maximum, then you will have a negative safety margin, and then you will be at risk. But if you're in a city that do not have the mean temperature of the warmest month, which is higher than this, then you are in a safe zone. And this could be calculated also for mean annual temperature, mean temperature of the warmest or coldest month, average precipitation, any other climatic variable you want or you think is important. So we use this to compare what was the situation in many cities in Canada, and even look at what will be some possible new species that we can bring from further south in US cities, where we look at what will be the future climate in Canada and what will be the analog in the US. And this is what is shown here in this clustering analysis. And then I'm going very quickly because I just want to illustrate the approach. But if we take a city at random in Canada, let's choose Toronto, very random. This study showed that there was 82 species that were at risk by 2050 using mean annual temperature as the safety margin. And the one city that had climatic analogs in 50 years was Pittsburgh. And in this city, there was 50 species that we found that could be moved into Toronto that can tolerate the current climate and the future climate. And 36 of these species were new species that don't occur in Toronto. So this is giving us some kind of an idea of what new species we may want to try in the future so that we can keep increasing the functional diversity of our species and make the trees in the city more resilient to climate change. This is another study that just came out last year, where we invited Julie because we needed some expertise in functional diversity and functional traits. As you have witnessed, she's a great expert in the field. And because we wanted to develop a new index that will integrate many things that are important in the city. The first one here is the safety margin. Now you know about safety margin, but we wanted to also integrate this question of abundance with the idea that the more abundant a tree in a city is, the more at risk you are, because you need one insect. Let's say you have a species that has 20% abundance, then you need one insect to lose 20%. Tree size is also important because the bigger the trees, the more likely they are affected by wind. And if you live in Montreal, by ice storm. Tree age, because we know that species don't live forever. The more they get older, the more they reach some kind of physiological limit. And so that if you have a lot of trees in one species that is old, then you know that you're more at risk of losing them. And the last part, which Julie contributed a lot, was what are the key functional traits that we found in our species that could be tolerant or could make the species tolerant to some of the risk that we will see in the future. So I don't want to go into details of how we calculated this, but we use Montreal as an example, and here's some of the results for these 5 different indices, the risk component. So when you look at this, you can have a kind of a picture for a big city like Montreal. Where are your risks? Is it in the tree age, in the tree size, the tree abundance? Should you be worried about the safety margin of your species, or maybe the diversity of functional traits that you have in relation to some key stresses? And then you can map that for the island of Montreal for each of these individual risks, or even combine them, which we did here, so you can realize where in the city you are maybe having higher risk, and some in yellow here in the island of Montreal were almost at one, so it means that they were areas where they have a combination of risk that could be related to species that have trait maladapted to the possible threat that are coming. Maybe they are old trees or they are big size. Finally, I wanted to talk a bit about the functional group, because you heard a lot about functional traits, how different species have different traits that can make them more resistant or resilient to different stressors. But we quickly realized, working with managers, that to help them maybe deal with that better, it was better to put trees into big categories, what we call functional groups. And here are all the trees that you can find in Montreal. And in a study, we put them into 5 large functional groups, with the idea that if you manage a street or a park, if you want to reduce the risk, like Julie explained, you should have species from these different functional groups. Then you will be less likely to lose them to a wind or a drought or a very high temperature or even an insect, because you have really spread the risk around. And this was actually explained in a recent paper in 2021 in this journal, where we say praise for diversity, a functional approach to reduce risk. And we have further developed this into, for each of these 5 big categories, we have subcategories. And these functional groups are being integrated. Oops, I'm sorry, I go too far now. I wanted to illustrate, maybe to better explain what are the importance of having different functional groups. Let's say you have 3 species in a park: sugar maple, an ash, and a red maple, or a silver maple, a poplar, and a yellow birch. We can calculate what is the functional diversity. And then you see that when you have these 3 species that are functionally similar, they have a low functional diversity, and they are in different functional groups. So that when you select them, you should maybe more going around like this and select species from different functional groups, so that you have a higher functional diversity and you have a street or a park that will be much more resilient to the future disturbances. So, big take-home message: increasing functional diversity of urban trees and parks will reduce your risk. And I want to finish very quickly before I pass the baton, or pass the puck, now that we are in the playoff. Talk about a tool that we have developed into, again, in my research chair at UQAM, a tool called CIF-IFC. If you're interested, you can go on the website and look at it. It's a tool that now is actually fairly well developed, that is centered around this idea of using functional group to help diversify cities in Canada, and eventually, we hope, in the world. So just to give you a very quick example, you could focus or zoom in into any area of your city if you have, if you know what the species are, and then you can calculate your functional diversity in a street, in a park, in a suburb. And for example, here, you can see that you have some group and subgroup that are very abundant, too abundant probably. So it means that if you have a stress that will impact a group in particular, you have more impact than if you had spread the species. And this can guide you when you go and need to replace species, or increase the canopy, which species from what group you should select. And then you can look in the functional group, and you have a variety of species, so you have some possibilities to select the best species, maybe the species that you like, or the species that provide you the best ecosystem services that you need for that area. We have incorporated in the tools other things like the Saint-Amour 10, 20, 30 rules, or the 5, 10, 15 rules. I won't go into a big debate here. I don't like these rules very much, but I was convinced that we could use and put them into the tool. And then we are starting to add other things like size and age of the trees so that we can calculate different indices of risk. And at the end, you can make decisions based on not just the functional diversity, but also some of the very key ecosystem services that you want. We are adding new ecosystem services, and this tool will become a tool that you can use anywhere in a city where you have these functional groups, where you have the right functional trait associated with your species. And I will finish by giving you an example of, we have applied this through actually a company, Habitat, that I co-founded with two other university professors. Here's an example in Candiac, which is a city close to Montreal that I like because most of our Montreal hockey players live there. So this is an important city for us. And you can see, we can look at the trees that are in the city, and then we can determine what are the functional groups, where they are, what are the value of these groups. But more importantly, we can look at each region, each tree, and make some recommendation if you want to increase the canopy or replace your species, which are the functional group that you should put there so that you have a street, a park, a neighborhood that is as resilient as possible. And I am passing you the puck, Julie.
Thanks for the assist, Christian. Okay, so last we want to conclude with a proposal to invite you to join us in making Canada a world leader in urban tree resilience by developing these trait-based tools. So as you have seen today in the talk, we show that there is tons of potential in trait-based tools for climate resilience, but we also have a lot of important gaps. The first gap is that functional groups and UTRIs need to be developed for the rest of Canada. So currently there's only functional groups for two regions, Montreal and Vancouver. Also UTRIs, because they were just developed last year, they've only been calculated for within the city of Montreal, but there's clearly a need for them to be developed for individual cities and different regions, because different regions will have different species pool, different climates, and will deal with different stressors. And of course, they have different trees planted in their cities. UTRIs also were just developed, so they need to be refined and validated through monitoring. So as you could see, there was 5 indices that go into building them, but maybe we didn't get it perfect the right time. Maybe we need to adjust their relative weighing, and we need to validate how well they work. And, a bit too quick. Also, the trait data is underpinning both of these tools, but it's often lacking. So there are many shortfalls. So first, the trait data is sometimes incomplete. We just don't have the trait values that we need for certain species, or those trait values come from regions that are really not local, sometimes not even within North America, which is a problem because we know trait values can vary a lot. We also have little data on trait variation within species. So again, we'll use a single trait mean, but we don't know variation among provenances or the variation due to plasticity. Changing the same tree and putting in a different environment will lead to different traits. We also don't have enough, or we don't have all the trait data from species that we could bring in from those climate analogs. So if we want to include them in our groups and make decisions about functional diversity, we need to know what their functional traits are. So currently, those tools are not yet scalable across Canadian cities. So here, what I mean by yet is that we're proposing to actually fill those gaps. We want to develop functional tools in more regions and in more cities. We also are thinking we could approach creating functional groups from different strategies or different perspectives. So what if some users really only want to stay with native species within Canada? So we could develop groups just for native species. But what if other cities want to include both the native species and those species from climate analogs? Then we'd have to put them in those functional groups and redo the grouping to include those different species. Same goes for functional traits. Right now, the way functional groups are done is essentially on the data that's available, but we know that they're not necessarily the best response traits based on those climatic stressors. So for example, seed size is correlated with species relative growth rate, which is correlated with other things, but it's not a direct response to those climatic stressors. So something else we'd like to do is build these functional groups based only on those climate response traits. So these are the traits that I showed you in that table. Or if we're really interested in addressing ecosystem services, we could develop functional groups only supporting, functional groups based only on those traits that support ecosystem services. To develop the UTRIs, we need to, like I mentioned earlier, we need to assess species level risk for more species that come from different locations. We can then develop, identify different neighborhoods that are at risk within each of those cities. And we want to improve and parameterize this index within individual cities. So we'd love to have user feedback, again, and validate with monitoring data, like I mentioned in the previous slide. And last, we want to improve our trait-based data to make better functional groups and better UTRIs. So we need to measure more trait variation within species and leverage it in those tools. So we want to measure traits of different provenances and native species. So here again, say that a city wants to maximize its functional diversity, but only have native species. If we know that this provenance has this trait value, this other provenance has this trait value, we could have a much bigger functional diversity still with native species because we took advantage of that natural variation within each species. We want to measure trait locally to have accurate data, and we want to measure trait plasticity, for example, by knowing how a trait differs when a tree is planted in an urban boulevard environment versus a natural environment or an urban, like forested lot, which is still a very different environment. So we're looking for, in conclusion, for partners from across Canadian cities, whether it's a city itself, it's a government at another level, NGOs, the industry, and we'd love your feedback about, does that meet your needs? If not, what are your needs? Which of these tools is more interesting to you? Also, of all the future directions for development I just talked about, which would be most useful? Would you be more interested in adding species from climate analogs? Would you be more interested in adding trait variation from different provenances, or maybe something else we haven't even thought about? So we'd love to hear from you. So we're inviting you to join us to build this climate resilient urban forest across Canada. We'd love to hear back from you right now, but if you don't have time to put a question in the chat or you want to sit and ponder on it and reach out to us later, here are our questions, our email addresses. So we'll take your questions and comments right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris and Julie, for the great presentation. But while we're waiting, I can ask a question. How can smaller municipalities with limited resources begin incorporating functional trait-based approaches to tree selection and urban forest planning?
Well, maybe I can answer this, Julie, but this is what we're hoping to develop this tool, Seal City, for all regions of Canada, because the tool is freely available, and we are hoping that eventually anybody from any city, and eventually, even if you're a private citizen who has a backyard and you want to know which species you want to plant to increase maybe the resilience of your backyard, but also of your neighborhood, then you will be able to use the tool. So this is the idea, is to develop some tools that could be available to anybody without having to pay anything.
Thank you, Chris. I think we got one question in the chat from Susan. Have you considered a community science avenue for collecting data?
I love that idea. I think there's a lot of engaged citizens right now, as we can see with the use of the app iNaturalist. And there is some data we could get from citizen science, so such as tree height, species ID, diameter. There's some, like the trait data, some of it won't be possible, but some traits are relatively easy to measure. So yeah, I'd love engaging the community in this. I don't know if you had something to add, Christian.
Yeah, let me add to this. This is a great idea, and we could develop some protocols or websites that people can measure simple things and add this to the website. I think that would be very useful. Absolutely.
You both. There are two questions from Laura in the chat. So the first question is, what measure of FD do you use in your urban forest studies? And the second question is, when it comes to FD, higher is better, but is there a threshold value above which you could call FD good?
That's a great question. I think it's directed at you, Christian, because you have done the urban forest study.
Yeah,
functional
yeah,
diversity. FD, everyone stands for functional diversity, by the way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I could answer this. We have used only a very few very well-known available traits that are available in these kind of data set. There's one called TRI that has a lot of the data set. So we are limited right now. Actually, we use only 5 to make this big functional groups. But we have tried a few more, and I think we have to do more testing. Some of them are highly correlated, autocorrelated, so they don't add much. But Julie has presented a lot of very important ones. For example, we have no trait for roots, and roots are so important and so missing. So this is where we need to do more studies and add some traits that are complementary that will add a better description and capture a better probably ability to have trees that will be resilient to many other factors. So this is very good comment. And is the higher the better? I think there's a maximum, of course, at one point. But usually, if you have a higher diversity, you tend to reduce the risk of losing many species from one disturbances. And I think this is the value of having a higher functional diversity.
Yeah. That's a good question. The threshold, I don't know. It's just like, oh, above 0.8, it's good enough. Like how, at some point to get the maximum functional diversity, you'd have to have one individual per species, but then you'll hit the limit of species number. And also it's not practical for nurseries. They clearly don't grow all the trees. So, I mean, there are clearly logistical limitations here, but I don't know. That's a good question. I'll have to think about that. Like, are we aiming, say, for a 0.7 or something, or yeah?
They are providing us with research question now.
Yeah.
That's good. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great idea. How diverse is good enough, you know? Yeah.
Thank you all for participating in today's webinar. And once again, thank you very much to Chris and Julie for the great presentation. Bye, everyone.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the very good questions. And as Julie mentioned, contact us if you have any questions or if you want to collaborate on our project, and we will answer you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.